Hello, I'm George Potter. Welcome to Gospel Tangents.
In our next episode, we'll continue along the Frankincense Trail. George Potter will tell us why he thinks Laman and Lemuel might have rebelled against Nephi and Lehi. We'll also talk about Nephi's broken bow. George has some really interesting insights into that. We'll also talk about the Land Bountiful, a land flowing with honey. Why was honey important to mention? Check out our conversation. Before you do that, just a couple things. I've got our latest transcript with Dr. Bill Smith out there on sale on Amazon, so get your copy now. Also, if you'd like to get a copy as soon as I complete each interview, please subscribe on our website. For just $10, you'll be the first to receive that. I've already sent out copies of Bill's transcript to our monthly subscribers. So if you'll do that, I'll be happy to send that to you. So please subscribe today at gospeltangents.com. Just click the yellow button. Now back to our conversation.
Interesting questions. Okay, so we found the Valley of Lemuel, let's say. Okay, with pretty high probability. There's no other streams in Arabia. In fact, it's a very important discovery because if you looked at some of the anti-Mormon literature that preceded what we were doing, they were saying, oh, there are geographical errors in the Book of Mormon. There are no rivers. There are no magnificent valleys. There are no fertile, bountiful lands where fruit grows in Arabia. It's a big desert. And you can look at any resource. There's no continually flowing rivers in all of Saudi Arabia. And that was what the literature said. And if you looked at even the CIA website, or the geological studies that were done by the U.S. Geological Survey of Arabia, they said there are no continual rivers or streams in all of Arabia. Well, I'm sorry, they didn't look where the Book of Mormon told them to look, because there's one right there, and it flows all year long. And we've proven that. Now, what do you do when you're just a curious guy looking for Petra, you find Mount Sinai, and you end up finding the Valley of Lemuel? What do? Well, I kind of wrote it up, took some pictures, took it to the Ensign magazine, and J. Todd said, well, that's very interesting. Who was the editor of the magazine at the time? He said, well, maybe why don't you go find the rest of it? You need to have a book. That's only a chapter. No, I'm not really interested in the rest of it. Well, it was a challenge he gave to me. My other companions all left Arabia who had been on that original trip, so it's kind of left to me to try to find the rest of Lehi's trail. And I thank our Heavenly Father that I had lots of support by Richard Wellington, who's co-author of my book, Lehi in the Wilderness, and just Tim Cedar, who helped me, my partner in the Nephi project, who developed the films for us, and just scores of other LDS who helped me with the resources and the time to try to find the rest of the trail. So I was really blessed that way. And actually, we spent about 5 years. We figure we traveled 75,000 miles in Arabia. You got to understand, Arabia is the size of Europe. It's a huge area. It's a big desert. We knew basically where the old trail went, but nobody that we knew of or in the literature I've ever found tried to retrace the Frankincense Trail. So we're probably the first group that actually retraced the trail. Now, we retraced all of it except for parts of Yemen. And I have no interest in going into Yemen at this time, okay, yeah, because of
the Civil War.
Civil War, and it's pretty loosey-goosey down there in terms of law and order. So we did dedicate ourselves to looking for the whole trail. So we followed the trail. The trail ends at the old frankincense harbor of Khor Rori in Oman. We were then challenged to find the trail, the whole trail, different chapters of it. And so piece by piece, we took each section of First Nephi that talked about their travels to see if we could actually trace it through Arabia. Mm-hmm. And it's much easier than you think, because when they leave the Valley of Lemuel, they went 4 days, and then they made camp at a place called Shazer. Okay, now Hugh Nibley, the linguist, talks about the fact that in 600 BC, it would not have been written Shazer like it's written today. It would have been Shigor, that the language changes. And I have maps that show both the old and the new spelling for Shazer. And I can show you maps today. I got a map right behind me that shows the campsite Shazar, okay, the old spelling for Shazar.
Okay.
Okay, it's on a map. It was on the trail, on the Pilgrim's Trail. That the map I have shows the Pilgrim's route for the Muslims who go from Cairo to Mecca. And the thing that's interesting is we know they followed the old Frankincense Trail because there's the water and the infrastructure to get them there. And their first campsite south of the Valley of Lemuel would have been a place called Shazar. So it's right there, a Book of Mormon name place. From Shazar, they traveled through what Nephi called the most fertile parts. That is actually a place name. He says they traveled in the most fertile parts. The part of the Frankincense Trail that leads from the town of Dedan, ancient Dedan, which is an amazing place anyway, because that's where the Lehianites, the people of Lehi, are from, which are probably the converts of Lehi because they only changed their name to the people of Lehi in the 5th century BC, 6th century BC, just the time Lehi would have been going through there. Anyway, that part of the trail is called the Mushaharin, and it's not me making this up. There's a guy named Nigel Groom, who is the expert on the Frankincense Trail. He's a British scholar. He's written 2 books on the Frankincense Trail, but he's also written a book called The Dictionary of Arabic Topography and Place Names. Okay, so this is the only dictionary that exists like this. You can go right there to Mushaharin and you'll see it translates to the most fertile pieces. It's his own writing, most fertile pieces. Nephi said most fertile parts. Pieces and parts are synonyms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, again, a Book of Mormon place name right along the Frankincense Trail. These villages that were through the most fertile part of the trail. So Nephi describes it. They went through the most fertile parts, then they went through the more fertile parts, and then finally they traveled, he says, for a space of many days, and then they had to stop to look for food. In other words, ain't fertile at all. They had to go hunting in the mountains.
Where Nephi broke his bow, right?
Where Nephi breaks his bow, okay? And it just so happens that the area there where bowwood grows in Arabia is a very small area, about 150 miles long. Atum is the name of the wood, and it would have been, again, right along the trail where Nephi would have been. So we document all this in our films and our books. But it's amazing, and it's up in the mountains, and up in the mountains is where all the game is in Arabia. They're not down in the desert, they're up in the mountains. So Nephi would have made his bow from this atum wood, which is a type of olive. He would have then gone up to the mountains to get the game. So it's all in context. From there, they travel and they get into a very desperate part of the trail. This is where there's open rebellion. Laman and Lemuel are contemplating at least killing Nephi and Lehi. They want to go back. Ishmael dies. They call the place Nahum. Brother Christensen, I forget his first name right now, from BYU, he was the first one to find area in Yemen with Nahum. At least, you see, in Arabic, you don't put in vowels. So on the maps, it would have been NHM, this area, this tribe of Nahum, this area Nahum in Yemen. So the trail went into Yemen, and there's quite a few places. We found maybe 10 or so places that have Nahum on it. Richard Wellington speculates that there's one Wadi Nahum, which is a little bit off the trail. It looks like they got lost. They ended up in this very barren part of the trail. And there they're contemplating murdering the father and their brother and going back to Jerusalem. They're going to starve. It's only the miracle of the Lord helping them that they survive at that point. Other people have speculated other parts, like Wadi Jof in Yemen, that is where Nahum was, and actually there's a Nahum there, a name place Nahum, but it doesn't have the context of the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon, it appears that they're lost. It appears that they're starving. they don't have any resources. If they're in a fertile area, why would they be starving? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But this area, this Wadi Nahum that we found, really is in a very deserted place. It's a desert. It's right off the trail. They miss the wells. They're in deep trouble, and the Lord has to save them. So we believe that's the best candidate for Nahum that we've found. Now, the interesting part is that when Ishmael dies, they're in Nahum, the Lord saves them. But it says then they travel from that part on. They travel, instead of being south-southeast, they then start to travel directly east. And so if you go directly east, the trail actually turns there in Yemen and heads east on the inside, the inland part of the mountain range that goes through southern Yemen and Oman. Between there and the Great Empty Quarter, which is an area the size of Utah, there's nothing but sand dunes. There's a little bit of a plain area there that you can travel on. It's flat, it's destitute, but you can travel on it. And there were halts where you could, by halts, I mean these are camel halts, caravan halts, where they had hotels, they had food, you could survive to support the frankincense trade. So the trail went through there and then came out in Oman in what's called the Salalah coastal plain today. So here you have Nahum. The trail actually turned east there, headed across Yemen and into Oman, and then ended up on the Salalah coastal plain. So again, all these things you can document today. It's amazing that you have 3 or 4 place names in the Book of Mormon. They're still visible there. You get to the Salalah coastal plain, and as you approach it, maybe you're 20 miles from the Indian Ocean, and you're still in the empty quarter. It's nothing but barren desert. Everywhere you look is just nothing. There's no grass, there's nothing. And it says in the Book of Mormon, they couldn't make much fire. The only thing to burn out there would be camel dung. There'd be nothing else to burn.
Wow. There
are outlaws out there too, which is probably because it's a wilderness, a really abandoned area. There's many reasons why they couldn't have had much fire. But the Lord made their meat sweet, which is very interesting. I'll explain later why that's very interesting. I didn't find out later why that was so interesting. But the Lord made their meat sweet, and it was raw. They ate it raw, not cooked. But they're in a very hot, desolate desert. 20 miles from the Red Sea, where the trail turns then and heads to the Red Sea, turns south. You have a little mountain range, some coastal hills you have to go across. 20 miles from the Red Sea, it's completely barren. You go over those mountains, you come down, and you think you're in Scotland. If it's after the monsoon season, it's completely green, wildflowers everywhere, trees everywhere. You think you're in a jungle, and it's really, really just shocking, the difference. And you have there in the Book of Mormon, they came to a land bountiful where there's much fruit and wild honey. The only place that honey was native in all of Arabia is right there in Oman. Okay. And it was, of course, wild back then, and still wild up to a few years ago. It's all cultured wildly. So, some speculate, they went to some wadi in the middle of nowhere, and they ate wild fruit and wild berries and nuts and stuff. And this makes no sense at all. The trail went right to the Salalah coastal plain, where it's very fertile. And they can document that where the trail ended at the harbor, the frankincense harbor, Korori, they go back to 300 BC, where they can find sorghum, cotton, coconut, all sorts of different fruit pollens that were growing there. And they're still excavating. So we basically know that there's actually fruit going there, domesticated fruit going there. I tell people in my presentations that when we're down there studying it, and we went through some really rough areas of camping and travel, but we camped at the Crown Plaza on the beach at Salalah, and we took a 4-mile trip to the Pizza Hut for dinner, and we passed 42 different fruit stands, banana, orange, coconuts, mangoes, you name it. Now, many of those fruits have been introduced since Lehi's time, but the whole area is a orchard. It's a beautiful area. Marco Polo called it the Garden City when he visited it. It's famous for its fruits, and it's right there where the trail ended. So you have to go back and say, okay, they were in the wilderness 8 years, and then they came to the Land Bountiful. So wilderness is where there's no people. Now bountiful, they come to a land they call bountiful. A land means people, usually. It's no longer they call it a wilderness. But they spent 8 years in a horrible environment. I mean, we talk about the Mormon pioneers going from across the plains 1,200 miles. Of course, it was horrible. You know, my ancestors suffered a great deal, but it's nothing compared to 2,200 miles that Lehi went through the Arabia. I mean, it's completely different. Arabia is really a tough environment.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with George Potter. You'll notice he mentioned a harbor called Korori. In our next conversation, we'll talk a lot more about this special harbor and why George thinks it's so important to the story of the Book of Mormon.
I think they knew exactly where they were going. They get to the Frankincense Harbor of Korori. What do you find there? You find there that you have a safe harbor where you can build ships. So in my book, Voyages of the Book of Mormon, we show you right there at the harbor at Korori, where they had the ancient ways. Ways are ramps where you build a ship, then you lower your ship into the water roll it down on logs, using gravity to get your ship into the water.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you like our page on facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe at youtube.com/gospeltangents. We're also on Twitter @gospeltangents, as well as make sure that you subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some more of our videos. Thanks again.